The sun had gone down on a warm autumn evening when I first met Sebastian. It was at a fancy party where everyone dressed in their nicest clothes and tried to act super important. People smiled a lot, even if they didn't feel like it, and talked about big things like business and money. I wasn't even supposed to go to the party, but my friend from work invited me at the last minute because she needed someone to come with her. When I saw Sebastian, he stood out right away. He was tall, wore a suit that looked like it was made just for him, and walked in a way that made everyone notice him. But he didn't seem like he was trying too hard to be liked. He was just confident. When he walked up to me, he smiled in a way that made me feel warm and happy, like I was the most important person in the room. Sebastian started talking to me, asking me questions about my job and my life. I told him about how hard it was working at a small marketing company where I had to come up with big ideas but didn't always get noticed. He listened so carefully, laughing at my funny stories and nodding like he really cared about what I was saying. It felt so nice to be heard. After that night, Sebastian and I started seeing each other a lot. It felt like something out of a fairy tale. He was everything I thought a perfect man should be: smart, rich, and confident. He always had big ideas and talked about how important it was to treat people fairly and include everyone, no matter who they were. He didn't like showing off how much money he had and said he preferred keeping his life simple, even though I could tell he enjoyed the finer things. Just 6 months later, Sebastian asked me to marry him. I couldn't believe it. He gave me a diamond ring that sparkled like the stars, and the way he looked at me made me feel like the luckiest person in the world. My parents thought we were moving a little too fast, but they supported me. My mom told me to trust my heart, and my dad, who's usually very quiet, had a long talk with Sebastian and decided to give his blessing. The wedding was like something out of a movie. It took place at a huge mansion with beautiful gardens full of colorful flowers. There were so many guests, most of them very rich and important people I had never met before. My family sat quietly in a corner, looking a little out of place in such a fancy setting, but they smiled and cheered for me because they were happy. That was all that mattered to me at the time. Still, there were little things that bothered me. Sebastian's mom, Vivienne, gave me looks like she didn't like me much. She didn't say anything mean, but her face said it all. His dad, Philip, spoke to my parents in a way that felt cold, like he didn't think they were good enough. Even Sebastian seemed different around his family. He wasn't the warm, kind man I had fallen in love with. Instead, he was more serious, like he had to act a certain way to impress them. After the wedding, I tried to focus on the good parts of our life. Sebastian was very busy with his job, so he wasn't home a lot, but he always called me at night. Even if it was just for a few minutes, it made me happy that he thought of me. When he was home, he surprised me with fancy gifts, beautiful dresses, shiny jewelry, and dinners at expensive restaurants. But then, little cracks started to appear. One evening, we went to a quiet dinner, just the two of us in a private room. A waiter accidentally spilled water on our table. I thought Sebastian would laugh it off, but instead, he got really mad. His words were so sharp and mean that the poor waiter looked like he wanted to cry. After the waiter left, Sebastian turned to me and smiled like nothing had happened. "Some people just don't know how to do their job," he said. I laughed it off, telling myself it was just a bad moment, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. As time passed, things got harder. Sebastian's parents started visiting us more often. Vivian always found ways to point out what I was doing wrong. "You should dress better," she would say. "A wife of Sebastian's stature needs to look the part." Philip ignored me most of the time, and when he did talk to me, it felt like he didn't care. Once he even said, "Sebastian could have married anyone. You should feel grateful." Whenever I told Sebastian how I felt, he would brush it off. "They just want the best for us," he said. "Don't take it personally." but it was personal. Every look, every comment made me feel smaller and smaller. Then one day I found out I was going to have a baby. I was so happy. I thought this would bring us closer together and Sebastian would be thrilled. But when I told him, he barely looked up from his phone. "That's good, I guess," he said, "but don't think you can start slacking off now. My parents expect everything to be perfect." I was hurt, but I kept hoping he'd change once the baby was born. Instead, things got worse. Sebastian became stricter, expecting the house to be spotless, the meals perfect, and me to always smile, even when I was tired or feeling sick. If I tried to rest, he'd say, "Pregnancy isn't an excuse. Stop being lazy." Vivienne and Philip started visiting more often. Vivienne would inspect everything like she was the queen of the house. "The flowers on the table are wilting," she said one day. "The roast is overcooked. Sebastian, I don't know how you tolerate this." Sebastian didn't stand up for me. Instead, he said, "She's still learning," like I wasn't even there. That night, after everyone went to bed, I sat in the guest room and cried. I realized I didn't feel like the happy bride I was on my wedding day. I felt like an outsider in my own home. The man who had promised to love and protect me seemed to care more about keeping his family happy than about how I felt. Sebastian started telling me I couldn't see my friends anymore. "They're a bad influence," he said. When I tried to argue, he snapped at me. "Do you know how lucky you are to be married to me? Other women would kill to have your life." I started to believe him. Maybe I was ungrateful. Maybe I expected too much. But deep down, I felt something was wrong. The Sebastian I married wasn't the same Sebastian I was living with. The kind, caring man I had fallen in love with had been replaced by someone cold and controlling. One weekend, Sebastian's parents came over for dinner again. I worked so hard to make everything perfect. I cleaned the house, cooked a big meal, and tried to hide how tired I was. But when Vivienne arrived, she looked around and said, "The flowers are dying and the food is overcooked." Sebastian didn't defend me. He just nodded and said, "She's still learning," as if I wasn't standing right there. That night, I cried myself to sleep. I felt so alone, even though I was married and expecting a baby. The man I had loved so much was gone, and I didn't know if I'd ever get him back. After everyone left, I asked Sebastian, "Why didn't you stand up for me?" My voice was shaking. Sebastian looked annoyed, like I was a little kid throwing a tantrum. "Because they're right," he said. "You need to do better. This isn't some small apartment you're used to. This is our home, and it needs to look nice." That night, I slept in the guest room. I stared at the ceiling, wondering how things got so bad. The man I loved wasn't the same anymore. He didn't see me as his wife, but more like someone to clean and cook for him. I was pregnant, and it should have been a happy time. But instead, it was like a nightmare. As the months went by, Sebastian got worse. He controlled how I spent money and asked me lots of questions about everything I bought. "Why do you need another dress?" he asked one day, holding up a receipt. "You're already too big for the ones you have." His parents, Vivienne and Philip, came over more often. They kept criticizing me, saying mean things about me. They acted like my pregnancy was a problem that messed up their lives. Vivienne even said we should hire a nanny after the baby was born so I could focus on cleaning the house. One day, I was so tired I fell onto the couch. My body hurt all over. Sebastian walked in and frowned. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Resting," I said weakly. "It's been a long day." "Resting?" he scoffed. "You've been home all day. Do you think I get to rest after working 12 hours for you?" I wanted to shout that being pregnant was hard work and that I was so tired, but I knew he wouldn't listen. Sebastian didn't care. To him, I was just part of the image he wanted to show the world. I started to feel like I was disappearing. I stayed quiet most of the time, trying to survive. My days were filled with cleaning, cooking, and listening to Sebastian and his parents criticize me. The love story I had believed in was a lie. One day, Sebastian announced, "We're going to the mountains next weekend." He was scrolling on his phone as I served dinner. I was 7 months pregnant, my belly big and my feet always swollen. I froze. Next weekend? I asked. I thought you were too busy with work. It's a family trip, he said, like that explained everything. By family, he meant his parents too. I didn't want to go. Spending a whole weekend with Vivian and Philip sounded horrible. I don't think I can, I said carefully, setting down a pot of stew. I'm 7 months pregnant. Traveling isn't safe. Sebastian looked up, annoyed. You're not sick, he said sharply. Pregnancy isn't a disability. Besides, my parents planned this for weeks. We can't cancel. His words hurt, but I swallowed my feelings. I knew arguing wouldn't change his mind. So a week later, I was in the back seat of Sebastian's fancy car. Vivian and Philip sat in the front, chatting about their trip. The drive was awful. Vivian kept talking about how much weight I'd gained. Philip made jokes about my pregnancy glow not being good enough. Sebastian didn't say a word. When we arrived at the cabin, I was so tired. My feet hurt and my back ached. But Vivian started bossing me around right away, telling me to unpack, cook, and set up the rooms. Sebastian didn't help me at all. He just listened to whatever his parents wanted. Later, I felt sharp pains in my stomach. At first, I thought it was normal, but it kept getting worse. By dinner, it was too much to hide. I grabbed my belly as another pain hit me. What's wrong now? Sebastian asked, annoyed. I think I'm in labor, I said, my voice shaking. Vivian rolled her eyes. It's too early. You're just being dramatic. I'm serious, I said, tears in my eyes. We need to go to the hospital. Sebastian sighed like I was bothering him. Can't you just wait? He asked. Wait, I said, my voice rising, but another pain stopped me from saying more. Sebastian finally stood up. Fine, let's go, he said, grabbing his car keys. I felt a little relieved, but then he stopped outside and stared at me. You're not getting in the car like that, he said, pointing at my soaked dress. Sebastian, my water broke, I cried. Exactly, he said coldly. You'll ruin the seats. I couldn't believe it. Are you serious right now? He didn't answer. Instead, he walked back into the house. Figure it out, he called over his shoulder. I stood there crying, holding my belly as the pain got worse. Just then I heard a voice. Eliza! It was my neighbor Isabel. She ran over, her face full of concern. I think I'm in labor, I whispered. Isabel wrapped her arm around me. Don't worry, I'll get you to the hospital, she said firmly. She helped me into her car and drove fast. The ride was a blur. The pain was so bad, but Isabel held my hand and kept saying, You're going to be okay. When we got to the hospital, nurses rushed me inside. I saw Isabel talking to the staff, calm and confident. For the first time in months, I felt like someone cared. The hours at the hospital were hard. Everything hurt, and I could barely stay awake. But Isabel stayed with me the whole time, holding my hand and encouraging me. Breathe, Eliza. You've got this, she said. Even though Sebastian had abandoned me, I wasn't alone. Isabel gave me hope, and for the first time, I believed I'd get through this. Isabel became my anchor in a way I hadn't expected. She was a constant presence, managing everything with an ease that I could never have mustered on my own. From the moment I realized I was in labor, she stepped in without hesitation, taking control of the situation. It was as though she had been preparing for this day her entire life. The doctors, who were kind but busy with their own tasks, barely noticed Isabel handling the logistics in the background. She spoke to them with calm authority, ensured my parents were informed, and made sure that I wasn't alone in the chaos of the hospital. As they wheeled me into the delivery room, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Fear swirled in my chest, tight and constricting, but right alongside it was something I hadn't allowed myself to feel for so long: determination. My mind raced with thoughts of the future, of the little one I would soon meet. This child, I reminded myself, was the one good thing to come out of the nightmare that had become my marriage. In the face of everything that had gone wrong, this baby was the one piece of hope I could cling to. Each wave of pain brought its own challenge, and it was a challenge that pushed me to the edge. I could feel my body writhing with intensity, every contraction racking my body in ways I hadn't thought possible. The pain wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. Each contraction a reminder of how my life had spiraled, how I had been forced to live in fear and silence for so long. But this time was different. This time I wasn't just enduring the pain. I was fighting for something bigger than myself, fighting for my baby, for the future that would be built on a love that Sebastian had never been able to offer. I closed my eyes, breathing through the waves of pains, reminding myself that I was doing this for the little life growing inside of me. I wasn't alone anymore, not physically, with Isabel by my side, and not emotionally, because this child, my child, was with me. It wasn't going to be easy, but I was ready. After what felt like an eternity of labor, the room suddenly filled with the sharp, high-pitched cry of my newborn. My heart leaped into my throat as I felt an overwhelming rush of emotion. I could barely breathe, and yet, somehow tears began to flow freely from my eyes. The nurse, smiling warmly, placed the tiny, swaddled bundle into my arms. I looked down at the delicate little face, the soft, peaceful expression, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. This was my child, my perfect, beautiful child. The weight of everything that had happened before seemed to momentarily disappear, and all I could focus on was this fragile, perfect little life in my arms. It didn't matter that Sebastian wasn't there. He had made it clear that he wasn't interested in being there for me or our child, and now I could see that for what it truly was. It didn't matter that his parents would likely never accept this baby as part of their family. None of that mattered. This baby was mine, and I would do everything in my power to give them a better life than I had ever known. My parents arrived shortly after, looking both relieved and worried. Their faces softened when they saw me holding the baby in my arms. My mother, who had always been so concerned about how I was doing, leaned down to kiss my forehead gently. Her eyes were filled with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief and love. "You're so strong," she whispered softly, her voice thick with emotion. My father, usually the stoic one, stood nearby, watching us with a quiet intensity. He walked over and carefully stroked my baby's tiny hand, his face softening with tenderness. "We'll take care of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not alone in this." I had been so worried about telling them everything, about revealing the full extent of the emotional turmoil Sebastian had put me through. But as I looked at their faces, all that worry melted away. They were here now, and they would help me rebuild. I wasn't alone anymore. Isabel stayed long enough to ensure that I was settled before quietly excusing herself. She gave me a reassuring smile and said, "If you need anything, call me. I'll check in on you tomorrow." Her kindness meant the world to me. Before she left, she gave my parents a meaningful look, one that suggested she had shared everything with them about Sebastian and the abuse I had suffered. Part of me felt ashamed that they now knew the truth of what had happened to me. I had spent so long hiding the truth, pretending everything was fine, for the sake of appearances. But as I looked into my mother's tearful eyes and saw my father's steady presence, I realized that it was a relief to finally let go of the burden of secrecy. The next morning, as I cradled my newborn, my phone began to buzz incessantly. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach when I saw the name on the screen. It was Sebastian. I had known the calls would come eventually, but I wasn't ready for this. I had no idea what he was going to say, and frankly, I didn't care. The message notifications were coming in faster than I could keep up with. I picked up the phone, hesitated for a moment, then began reading his frantic messages. "Eliza, where are you? I heard you went into labor. Why didn't you call me? This is unacceptable. I'm your husband. I deserve to know what's going on. You're making me look bad. Call me back immediately." My heart sank as I read his words. Anger surged inside me, but it wasn't the kind of anger I had once felt. It wasn't the anger of someone who was still looking for his approval or trying to keep things calm. It was the kind of anger that came from knowing how deeply he had betrayed me. Sebastian's concern wasn't for me or for the baby. It was only for his own reputation. My hands shook as I turned off the phone, refusing to engage. I knew that any response would only make things worse. There was no use in trying to explain myself to someone who had never cared for me, who only cared about his image and his power. A few hours later, Isabel returned to the hospital. This time, she brought a fruit basket with her, a simple gesture, but it meant so much. Her warm smile as she entered the room made me feel like I wasn't alone in this journey. We sat and talked quietly while my parents hovered over the baby in the corner. Isabel's presence was like a balm to my soul, soothing the wounds I had carried for so long. She was one of the few people who had always been there for me, who had seen me at my lowest and never judged me. As we talked, she casually dropped a bombshell that left me stunned. "My husband confronted Sebastian," she said, her tone careful. "Sebastian has been fired." The news hit me like a wave crashing against the shore. I stared at Isabel, unable to process what she was saying. Fired? It was almost too much to take in. How could that even be possible? "Fired?" I echoed, my voice trembling slightly. Isabel nodded. "Yes, my husband is the CEO of Sebastian's company. He said Sebastian's behavior wasn't just bad for his marriage, it's bad for business. He can't have someone who disrespects their family in charge of anything." I was speechless. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for Sebastian, but that part was quickly squashed by a wave of relief and something darker, more satisfying. Sebastian had used his power and his position to control me, to manipulate me, to make me feel small. But now, it seemed that power was slipping away. The very things he had used to hurt me were turning against him. For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. In the days that followed, I began to rebuild my life. I moved back into my parents' house, and they made sure I felt safe. They had prepared a room for me and the baby, filling it with soft colors and small touches that made it feel like a place of peace. It wasn't the grand mansion I had lived in with Sebastian, but it felt warmer, more like home. I didn't feel trapped in a cold, empty house anymore. Isabel continued to be my rock. She checked in regularly and offered to help in any way she could. Her husband, the CEO, had also offered me a job at his company. It was a position that allowed me to work from home so I could take care of my baby and still contribute financially. It was a lifeline, something I hadn't expected but desperately needed. Meanwhile, Sebastian's life seemed to fall apart. The news of his firing spread, and people began to distance themselves from him. His reputation, built so carefully on lies and appearances, began to crack. Even his parents, who had always been so proud of their wealth and status, couldn't hide the shame. They tried to contact me, but I refused to respond. They had never been there for me when I needed them, and now they were just trying to protect themselves. He didn't want me back because he loved me. He wanted me back because his life was falling apart, and he thought getting me back would fix things for him. One day, out of the blue, he showed up at my parents' house. I didn't expect to see him, but there he was, standing at the door like nothing had changed. My father, who had always been strong and protective, opened the door and looked at Sebastian with cold, unyielding eyes. "You're not welcome here," he said firmly. Sebastian tried to argue, his voice pleading, trying to explain himself. "I just want to see my wife and child," he said, but my father didn't soften. "She's not your wife anymore," he replied without a hint of hesitation. "You made it clear what your priorities were when you left her on the side of the road." I was standing in the window, holding my baby close. Watching that scene unfold, I felt a rush of emotions. Sebastian left that day, humiliated and defeated. I felt a strange sense of closure. For the first time in years, I knew he no longer had control over me. I was free, completely free. Living at my parents' house felt like stepping into a whole new world. It wasn't a big, fancy house, but it was full of love, warmth, and support. Their home had a special kind of quiet, the kind that makes you feel safe. Every part of their house seemed to radiate comfort. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread and hearty meals, with my mom always in there preparing something delicious. The nursery my dad set up for the baby wasn't grand, but it was filled with care. It wasn't much, but it was exactly what I needed. It was a home where I could heal and finally breathe again. My mornings started early, with the soft cries of my baby waking me up. Despite the sleepless nights, I found joy in the small things, the little yawns, the baby's first gurgles, the tiny smiles that made my heart swell. My parents were there, always willing to help whenever I needed a break. They would take the baby, showering them with love and affection. Their support gave me the space to heal, both physically and emotionally. I hadn't realized how much I had been missing until I was surrounded by their constant care. Work became something that helped me feel like myself again. Isabel's husband had kept his promise and gave me a job that allowed me to work from home. It was a mix of writing and research, something I could manage while taking care of my baby. At first, I was nervous. I hadn't worked in a long time, and I wasn't sure if I could balance everything. I even worried that I had lost my touch, that I had forgotten how to do my job because of the chaos my marriage had caused. But as I threw myself into the work, I found a sense of purpose again, something I hadn't felt in a long time. The first project I completed was a report on market trends. It was a small task, but it was something I could be proud of. When Isabel's husband called me to talk about it, his praise made me feel like I could conquer the world. "Excellent work, Eliza," he said, his tone warm and encouraging. "You've got a sharp mind. I'm glad we brought you on board." Those words meant more to me than he probably realized. For so long, I had been made to feel small, as though my worth was tied to my role as Sebastian's wife. But now I was proving to myself and to everyone else that I was capable of so much more than that. As I rebuilt my life, Sebastian's life continued to unravel. Isabel kept me updated on what was happening. He was struggling to find another job. His reputation in the corporate world had been completely ruined after the viral video and the gossip that followed. Even his parents, once highly respected and admired in their social circles, had become outcasts. The wealth and power they had once relied on couldn't shield them from the judgment they now faced. One day, Isabel told me that Sebastian had tried to reach out to her husband, begging for a second chance. "He's desperate," she said, her voice tinged with disdain. "But my husband isn't entertaining it. He told Sebastian that actions have consequences and that he's no longer welcome in his company." I felt a strange mixture of emotions when I heard this. Part of me was glad that Sebastian was finally facing the consequences of his actions. He deserved it. But another part of me felt a quiet sadness, not for him, but for the life I had once imagined we could have built together. That dream was gone now, and I had accepted it, but the scars were still there. The wounds had healed, but they weren't fully gone. As the weeks turned into months, my confidence grew. I found my rhythm between work and motherhood, and I began to enjoy the small, everyday moments. My baby was growing and thriving, and every little achievement felt like a victory. I promised myself that I would create a better life for us, built on love, respect, and resilience. I would never again let anyone, especially Sebastian, make me feel worthless. One day, Isabel came over with a big bag of baby clothes and toys. "These are from my son," she said, smiling as she handed it to me. "He's outgrown them, but they're still in great condition." I was overwhelmed with gratitude. "You've already done so much for me," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." Isabel placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. You don't have to repay me, she said softly. Just focus on building the life you deserve. Her words stayed with me long after she left. For so many years, I had been living in Sebastian's shadow, trying to meet his impossible standards. But now, I was free to define my own path, to be the kind of mother and person I wanted to be. One evening, as I rocked my baby to sleep, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. The woman looking back at me was different from the one who had stood on the side of the road, abandoned and broken. This woman was stronger, more determined. She had faced the worst and survived. She was whole again. Later that night, as I worked on a project, I got an unexpected email from Sebastian. The subject line simply read, "Please." My heart skipped a beat. Against my better judgment, I opened it. It was long, filled with apologies and pleas for forgiveness. He said he had changed, that he realized the mistakes he had made. He begged me to give him another chance and to let him be part of our child's life. I stared at the screen for a long time, my emotions swirling inside me. Part of me wanted to believe him, to hope that he had truly changed, but the deeper, wiser part of me knew better. His words were empty. They weren't about love. They were about desperation. He didn't want me back because he loved me or the baby. He wanted me back because he needed to fix his broken life. I closed the email without replying. Sebastian had made his choices, and now I was making mine. My life was no longer tied to his. It was mine to shape. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my baby's laughter. Sunlight poured through the curtains, painting the room in soft golden light. I scooped my baby into my arms, holding them close as they giggled and reached for my face. In that moment, I felt a deep, unshakable sense of purpose. This was my new life. It wasn't perfect, but it was filled with love, hope, and endless possibilities. I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. While I was finding peace, Sebastian's life continued to fall apart. I didn't need Isabel's updates to know how bad things were for him. One day, my lawyer called me. He sounded both exasperated and amused. "Sebastian is trying to contest the divorce," he said. "He claims he still loves you and that the baby needs a father." I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "This is ridiculous," I said. But my lawyer reassured me, "Don't worry, he has no grounds to contest. The court won't look favorably on his behavior." I felt a flicker of relief. The end of this chapter was finally drawing closer. Sebastian's life kept getting worse. His reputation was beyond repair. Employers didn't want to take a chance on someone whose name had become synonymous with scandal. Even his own parents couldn't help him anymore. They had once been respected and admired, but now they were avoiding public places. Sebastian tried to salvage his image with public statements, but the internet was ruthless. People refused to forget. Then one day, Isabel told me that Sebastian had shown up at her house, disheveled and desperate. He asked Isabel's husband for help, but Isabel's husband turned him away. "I trusted you once," he said. "You betrayed that trust, not just with your actions against your wife, but in the way you've conducted yourself in the company and beyond. There's no place for someone like you here." Sebastian left that day, defeated. I think he finally realized just how far he had fallen. Finally, the court ruled in my favor. The divorce was granted, and Sebastian was ordered to pay child support. He tried to fight it, but there was no way to change the decision. The property division was simple. I had no interest in his wealth or assets. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. But things didn't end well for Sebastian. News spread about his money problems. He had spent too much, living a fancy life he couldn't afford. Without a job or his old friends, he couldn't keep up with his bills and had trouble paying for his house. Reports spread through Isabel's friends that Sebastian had to move back in with his parents. A big house he used to show off was taken away by the bank. His parents, Vivian and Philip, were already struggling with their own problems, and now they had to deal with Sebastian's mess too. During all of this, I thought a lot about the life I had left behind. I didn't feel happy about Sebastian's downfall. I just felt like things were finally over. Sebastian had built his life on being rude and selfish, and now his life was falling apart. I didn't carry the hurt from him anymore. I had let go of his judgment and betrayal. Instead, my life was full of new beginnings. My baby was the most important thing in my life, and they reminded me every day that I was strong. My work was doing well, giving me a sense of independence and purpose that I hadn't felt in years. My parents, who had always been there for me, continued to support me in everything. One night, as I was rocking my baby to sleep, my phone buzzed. It was an email from Sebastian. The subject said, "I'm sorry." I stared at it for a moment, thinking about whether to open it. I decided to read it. The email was long and full of apologies. Sebastian admitted that he was wrong and said he wanted to change and be a better person. I read everything carefully, but when I finished, I didn't reply. Sebastian's journey was no longer my concern. My focus was now on my future, my child, and the new life I was building, one that was free from Sebastian. As I stood by the crib, watching my baby sleep peacefully, I felt a deep sense of calm. Sebastian's problems were his fault, and now he had to face the consequences of his choices. My life, on the other hand, was moving forward with hope and possibilities. Life had found a new rhythm, and it was a rhythm that was just mine. Each morning started with my baby's cries, their small hands reaching out, trying to discover the world. Every moment with them was a reminder of my strength and how far I had come. My parents' house felt like a safe, loving place. My father, who was usually quiet, had turned into a wonderful grandfather. He would read books to my baby, his deep voice making them feel safe and calm. My mother, always busy with something, would sneak into the nursery just to watch the baby sleep. Her eyes would fill with love. Work was giving me a new purpose too. The job that Isabel's husband had offered me was more than just a job. It was a chance to be independent again. I threw myself into my work, finding joy and pride in what I did. The flexibility of working from home allowed me to balance my job and motherhood. For the first time in years, I felt like I was truly thriving. Isabel was always there for me, visiting with food or offering to babysit. Her friendship had helped me heal. One evening, she and her husband invited me and my parents over for dinner. It was a small, cozy dinner, but it felt so special. As we sat around the table, laughing and talking, I felt a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in a long time. During the meal, Isabel's husband looked at me thoughtfully. "You've been doing great work," he said. "Have you thought about taking on more responsibility at the company?" I was surprised. "Expanding?" I asked. He nodded. "I think you're ready for more." His belief in me filled me with both excitement and a little fear. Taking on more would be a big step, but looking at my baby sleeping in the crib, I knew I was ready to prove to myself that I could do it. "I'd love to," I said. "Thank you for believing in me." Meanwhile, Sebastian's life kept getting harder. Through Isabel, I heard that his money problems had gotten worse. He didn't have steady work or the people he once knew. He was having trouble paying bills, and the big house he used to have was gone. He now lived in a small apartment with his parents. People who once admired him started talking about his fall from grace. His name, which used to stand for success, was now a warning to others. Even his parents, Vivian and Philip, stayed away from the public. They were ashamed of what had happened to their family. I didn't feel happy about their sadness, but I did feel like I had closed that chapter of my life. They had built their lives on being rude and unfair, and now they had to face the consequences. I wasn't focused on them anymore. My attention was on my future, the one I was building for myself and my child. As the months passed, I started seeing the world in a new way. My baby's laughter filled my days with joy. Every little thing they did, like rolling over, smiling, or taking their first steps, felt like a victory, not just for them, but for me too. I was giving them a life filled with love and security, a life that was far from the pain of the past. One day, while sitting in the park and watching my child explore, I thought about how much I had changed. The woman I used to be, who felt abandoned and broken, seemed so far away. Now I was stronger, someone who had faced difficult times and come out even stronger. It was during one of these peaceful moments that I decided to write about my experiences. I wanted to share the pain, but also the strength I had found along the way. The words came easily, and writing was a way to help me process everything I had been through. Over time, my writing turned into something more. It became a story of hope, a message about how we can grow even when life is hard. I shared my story online, not knowing what would happen. The response was overwhelming. So many people, especially women who had been through similar struggles, reached out. They thanked me for sharing my journey and for giving them hope. I realized that my story was helping others, showing them that they could also find their way out of their struggles. One night, as I tucked my child into bed, I whispered a promise to them. "You'll grow up knowing love," I said. "You'll know kindness and respect, and you'll always know how valuable you are." That promise became my guide. I was determined to raise my child in a better world, one where love and respect were always there. As I looked at their peaceful face, I felt a wave of hope. I believed the future could be brighter, not just for us, but for anyone willing to work for a better life. The past no longer had power over me. My life was mine to shape, and I was ready to embrace everything the future had in store for me. With my baby in my arms and hope in my heart, I stepped into a future full of love and endless possibilities. Thanks for watching. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Check out our other videos too. See you in the next one.